Baseball is back, and the first pitch is on Netflix. The New York Yankees, led by 7-time All-Star Aaron Judge, head to the San Francisco Bay to take on Rafael Devers' San Francisco Giants. This season kicks off with one exclusive opening night game. Watch MLB Opening Night, the New York Yankees versus the San Francisco Giants, live on Netflix. Tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Start your day with Quaker Protein Instant Oatmeal. The instant oatmeal ready to help you tackle whatever your day brings. Like wrangling your toddler into their car seat. That was fun. Coaching your 6th graders soccer team. Go girls! And carrying all the groceries in one trip. Whew. Try Quaker Protein Instant Oatmeal, granola, and bars. Great taste and a good source of protein. Quaker, bring out the good.
Hello and welcome back to the Dunbar End podcast here on the Hibs Observer. I'm Jack Harris, joined as ever by Hibs Observer editor Patrick McPartland. There's a lot to discuss today, even though Hibs don't have a fixture coming up with the international break in full swing at the weekend. But a lot to digest after an interesting performance at Motherwell, some sort of swings and roundabouts, positives and negatives to go through. First of all, I mean, you said positives and negatives. What was the overwhelming positive from you from Fir Park on Saturday?
I think the overwhelming positive is that compared to the last time Hibs went to Fir Park, it was a much improved performance. I think you look back to that game in November, David Gray said afterwards it wasn't, he didn't recognise that as being his Hibs side. And I think it's probably fair enough. We've not seen too many performances like that from Hibs this season. And there was a lot to like about the defensive performance. There was a lot to like about the way that I think Hibs largely stopped Motherwell from playing their game. Good defensive work, a lot of good work in midfield as well. And I think ultimately, like the kind of main thing that it kind of fell down on for Hibs was just that sort of lack of chance creation. And I mean, one shot on target speaks for itself. Lack of touches in the penalty area by the 4 strikers also tells a story. So I think, one of those games where I think in the wider context of the season, it looks disappointing just because of what's at stake, what Hibs are trying to achieve before the season's out. But as a kind of standalone, to go to a place that has been quite a formidable venue for a lot of teams. Motherwell, I think, have only lost once at home this season. So it's in that basis, it's a good point. It's a good result, but I think given the fact that Hibs had drawn 0-0 against Livingston the previous weekend, and if everything that's at stake, it does look a little bit, like so much of this season, a little bit underwhelming. Yeah,
you mentioned the strikers. We'll maybe pull up some of the graphs I've got in front of me on the video. But Ante Schutter, I mean, starting the game alongside Martin Boyle. You look at the touches. I mean, I think there was a point that you pointed out that I think between the 4 of them, they had something like 5 touches within the box. So I'm looking at Schutter. He's got 2 sort of on the edge, just in front. 2 they're in the box, but are just sort of, I think one of them was a shot, and it's just at an impossible angle. He's not going to do anything with that, but you can kind of see that how deep they were having to play. Obviously, Motherwell being a great press inside. I think Boyle had a similar issue. He maybe plays that game slightly better, slightly deeper in the park. I think was it Craig Nisbet that said that like,
yeah, we've seen Boyle sort of call into these games because of his defensive abilities, because of his ability to kind of aid the press, because he can drop back into into the midfield when required. So I think easy to see why. For Martin Boyle, for instance, he didn't have that many touches in the box. And the same with Shuto. I mean, you look at his touch map after the game, you could see where he'd been doing a lot of his work, and not very much of it was in the attacking third. And I think it's one of those games where I think it needs a full team performance. It needs pressing from everyone to to really kind of shut Motherwell down and stop them from playing their game. I think I think Shuto had something like 37 pressures throughout his time on the pitch, which would have been about 67 minutes, which was the most of any Hibs player. So I think, that tells a story in itself that, perhaps a team pick to, stop Motherwell from playing. I know that there was a bit of an inference from Jens Barlaser afterwards that, maybe Hibs would have been happier with a point. I think, some people suggested Hibs had gone there purely to play for a point. I'm not entirely sure that that's the same as trying to stop Motherwell from playing.
Do you think? Do you think there's merit in that? Because I remember we were speaking in the press deck, and it's when David Gray brings on, it was Kai Andrews and
Josh Campbell,
and we both sort of thought, is this a team that's happy with these last 10 minutes, just trying to take this point and not necessarily go up and try and win the game?
Yeah, I think that could be part of it. I think a point from Motherwell, given how well they're going this season, as I said before, it's out of context. It's not the worst point in the world. It could be very useful come the end of the season. But I think just the way Hibs' season's been going and the fact that, they did have that goalless draw against Livingston the weekend before, then it looks, possibly kind of worse, quote marks, than it actually is. But I think, if you're the manager, you're looking at that and thinking, by the time you get to sort of the final 10 minutes, you may be thinking there's not, we're not likely to get a goal out of this, but what we can do is protect what we've got. And if you finish the game with a draw, as they did, then you've not lost any ground on Motherwell. That was one of Gray's sort of points afterwards. You've not lost any ground, and despite playing the 90 minutes at Fir Park, nothing's really changed from beforehand. And Gray was sort of very quick to say there's still a lot of football to be played. They still have to play each other again post split, and I think that that result had a lot of fans thinking that any hopes Hibs might have had of finishing fourth are kind of out the window, but I don't think Gray sees it like that. I don't think the players see it like that. And I think they would probably look at it as a good point based on the last performance there, based on what Motherwell have done to other teams at Fir Park. And you look at it and you say it is, I think that's something like 1 defeat in 8, and I think 5 without loss. But I think it's also, you look at the draw with Dundee and then the draw with Livingston and then a draw with Motherwell, it is a bit underwhelming, like we were saying. It does look a little bit like a team that's kind of going through the motions a little bit, just kind of meandering towards, the end of the season. And, Hibs, it's kind of in Hibs' hands to make sure that's not the case. They've got 2 big, arguably winnable games coming up before the split, and then obviously a big test after the split against top 6 teams who they haven't had the best of records against so far this season. And, those final 5 games are really a chance to, sort of put a bit of a different narrative, a bit of a different spin on how the season's played out.
I'm torn somewhat, because I think back to, you make the very valid point that you've not lost any ground. David Gray said that himself. Obviously a decent run in terms of not losing games, but also not picking up those points. Now I think back to being at the press conference on Friday before the Motherwell game. I think I alluded to this in the post-match briefing, but I kind of sat with it and sort of let it stew a little bit longer. That one of the things David Gray said right towards the start was, I think he either said this was a must-win game and then corrected himself, or said, people will look at this and think this is a must-win game, but I'm not sure it is a must-win game. Now, like on the basic definition, right? It's not, because you don't have to. There's not really anything.
Every game's a must-win game.
You could argue
it's a results business.
Every game's a must-win game, but you look at that 6-point gap and think that, I don't know, is it a mentality thing that you want somebody to be saying that's a must-win game? Because I mean, admittedly, like Motherwell, we've spoken about this in the office today, have 2 games coming up against Falkirk and Hearts. Either one of which, I mean, Falkirk have not been on the best run of form recently, but either one of those teams can take the fight to Askew and Motherwell. But it does feel like you kind of want that to be in your own hands. And I know David Gray has said, our fate is, Hibs' fate is in their own hands, but it does. There's an air that perhaps it isn't now, having lost. There's only the one direct chance to actually take something from Motherwell coming up.
Yeah, well, you say 6 points, but when you look at the goal difference, it's actually more like 7.
Exactly. Yeah.
It is a big gap. So there are different ways of looking at it, and I think this is something that David Gray says a lot. That you can look at that point against Motherwell as a good point, as a bad point, as an indifferent point. But I think in the same way that, for example, Hibs talking about going for Europe, they don't want to be relying on certain teams winning the Scottish Cup to kind of get a backdoor entry into continental competition. They want to be able to do it on their own terms. And I think if they're serious about that, then, that is the kind of game, that's when it is a must win. And, I think that, David Gray talks a lot about changing history in positive ways. And I think getting a result against Motherwell at Fir Park would have done a lot for, his own kind of CV, if you like. It would have done a lot for, for the team. It would have done a lot for the club this season, because since the European games, it hasn't quite felt the same. It's sort of felt like there's just been this kind of lingering European hangover.
Yeah.
And there's obviously the loss of the late goals has been kind of hammering them all season as well. And I think that you can look at the games against Livingston and Motherwell, and you can say, well, they might not have scored any goals, but they didn't concede any. They kept 2 clean sheets. I think that's Raphael Salinger up to 10 for the season. So I mean, there's so many different ways you can frame these results, but I think it's accurate to say, I think that Hibs' fate is in their own hands. There is a lot of football still to be played, relatively speaking, in that we don't know. Hibs could get 6 points from the next 2 games. Motherwell could get none, and then that sets it up for a really interesting run of games post split. But it does feel a little bit like too often this season when Hibs could have really done with a result, whether it's the Scottish Cup, whether it's the League Cup earlier on in the season, whether it was Legia Warsaw, whether it's been just games like this. I mean, they could have done with the 3 points against Livingston. They could have done with 3 points against Dundee. They could have done with 3 points against Motherwell. So on that basis, it doesn't look great. But I suppose what you have is, you've got a team who want to finish the season strongly. You've got individuals like Martin Boyle who want to go out on a high, want to help the club get back into Europe. And I suppose it's about kind of keeping the dressing room focused on, getting into Europe, getting that 4th place. So, I suspect that's probably why we're not seeing too much in the way of, yes, this is a must-win game, and sort of searching for the positives from a performance when, there were negatives as well. And I think it's about kind of protecting, protecting the squad from that outside noise and just trying to keep them focused on the task at hand, which, it's probably difficult at times. And, I think that, we talk about this Hibs team this season, it has felt a wee bit underwhelming at times. There have been players who've maybe not quite been at the levels that they were at last season, and they've probably missed some of the players that were there last season, the likes of Dwight Gale and Hector Triantis. It's very clear to see. But, they do have the chance to finish the season strongly, and, it's something that not too many managers have managed to do in Hibs history. So, I think obviously it's affected by who's leading the table. It's affected by poor performance in the Cups. But, it is still there. There is a possibility that Hibs could finish the season strongly, that they could overhaul Motherwell, but it needs sort of fewer performances and results like 0-0 draws and a few more where they're kind of snatching 1-0 victories against a run of play, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned Nectar Triantis there, brings us on to our next point, because I've read a lot, I'm sure you've read a lot too, there's been a lot said about Hibs' inability to find that sort of Nectar Triantis replacement since he left. Obviously being on loan from Sunderland, didn't take up any option to continue and went to the MLS, doing very well there. So it seems like a good move for him. But in terms of that sort of Nectar Triantis shaped hole, I think there's been frustration, is that fair to say, around Barlaser not being the most likely player to fill that hole, so being the person that's kind of in that space but not necessarily performing exactly the same role as he was.
Yeah, it's certainly not a like for like player.
Yeah.
I think when you look at the Hibs midfield at the moment, I don't think there's any one player who kind of fits the profile of Triantis. That's why he was such a sort of good pickup last season, why he just sort of really made that role his own, and I think a big reason why Hibs had that 17 game unbeaten run. Why they won the midfield battle in so many games, because they just had Triantis there. And he wasn't perfect. There was still a lot of improvements needed. But I think, as you say, you see from what he's doing in America that he has kind of continued that trajectory. Now seems to be scoring kind of 30-yard goals every week. Yeah. And I think it's always a danger that you can fall into this trap of trying to replace a player like for like to the detriment of the rest of the team. And I think we probably saw that with the forwards as well, that there probably wasn't a concerted effort to try and replace Dwight Gale, because somebody like that is a bit of a one-off, that it is difficult to find somebody and say, here's someone who can replicate what this player did last season. So I think when you bring in somebody like Josh Mulligan, for example, I know he's out injured, but that's someone who kind of has the box-to-box tendencies that Triantis had. Barlaser is somebody who maybe has the passing ability that Triantis had. But again, it's like a combination. It's trying to fit one player's skill set across two, maybe even three midfielders. And I think, it's been difficult for Hibs. And when you look at the kind of vast array of people they've had playing in midfield, whether it's Barlaser, whether it's Andrews, whether it's Chaiwa, whether it's Mulligan, Levitt at the start of the season. Campbell's been in there a few times. We had Jamie McGrath. We've obviously had, I think Rudy Milotnikov's had, sort of bits and pieces here and there.
Games, yeah.
And I think it is difficult to look at Hibs last season in the midfield and say, well, how can we replicate that? I don't think they've tried to do that with the players they've got. Barlaser is someone who I think we've seen can be really effective in certain games and not so effective in other games.
Yeah.
I think there have been questions over his suitability, if you like, for games against teams who are going to attack Hibs, who are going to, not just sit back and let Hibs have the ball. I think against Motherwell, we saw a slightly different side to him. He had a bit more aggression, playing further forward a bit more, just sort of trying to sort of pick out some of those passes to try and unlock the Motherwell defence.
Yeah, I've got the graph here from the Motherwell game. So looking at it, it's exactly like you say, trying to take those passes from a little bit further up the pitch. You can see his involvement sort of round about the centre circle and beyond. I mean, you look at the success rate of those passes, and it's not necessarily the sort of the best statistics ever. You see a few of them are going astray, but if you compare that to something, I just got up his forward passes against Livingston, which hopefully aren't loading, but I can sort of remember what happened. The success rate is higher, and you kind of see similar patterns, but what was happening against Motherwell, just like you said there, was showing more of an impetus to get forward, to move the ball forward, to find those sort of attacking avenues. He was the one who had that sort of diagonal ball when it goes back from Ahora through Paslak and through to I've completely forgotten his name. Just talking about him. Goes through to Dan Barlaser and he sort of boots it all the way out on the diagonal to Nicky Cadden, that generates that chance there. That sort of thing. I know you said in your piece that's what Hibs need to see more over the next few games and then into the split as well. But it's that almost sort of finding that Barlaser finding that sort of Triantis play style somewhat, and as sort of getting those attributes into his game will be really important in terms of, do Hibs then go on and make that loan deal permanent, or try and make that loan deal permanent?
Yeah, I mean, this time last season, Hibs fans were saying, they quite happily see Triantis signed on a permanent. I'm not seeing the same level of kind of clamour for Barlaser to be signed up on a permanent. And, this is a player who's had a lot of games in the English Championship and in League One, somebody who probably won't be short of offers. And, in leagues where there's less of a kind of split between kind of top six, bottom six type thing, then, maybe that's a better fit. We just don't know. He's not, as far as I'm aware, got a future at Middlesbrough, so it looks like he will be moving on in the summer. But I suppose the sort of question Hibs have to approach is he somebody, like, can they carry him if he's not going to have the same impact in games against sort of top six teams, shall we say? And that's why I think his performance on Saturday was interesting, because it was different to what we've seen. It was that little bit more aggressive. There was more of a sort of focus on trying to play forward more. And I think if he can play like that against Motherwell, then he can play like that against other teams. And I sort of suppose the big test now is, can he replicate that, not just in the next two games, but also in the post-split fixtures, and how useful that could be for Hibs in terms of their kind of season's ambitions. But I think that it's one of those situations where you consider who else is leaving Hibs at the end of the season. Martin Boyle's obviously going. There's Eli Yuan out of contract as well. There's other loan players whose temporary contracts are coming to an end. So there is going to be a bit of rebuilding at Hibs, I think, in the summer. And if you sort of think about the midfielders they've got, at the moment they've still got Mulligan. If there's going to be interest in the summer, it wouldn't surprise me. He's obviously pushing to come back before the end of the season. Joe Newell's in there. You've got Miguel Chaiwa as well. You've got sort of different profiles of midfielders, but it's whether you sort of try and go out and find the Triantis role, and if there's anyone who fits that better than Barlaser does, or whether you sort of try and explore the possibility of bringing Barlaser in on a permanent deal, but then making sure the players around him let him play a certain way. Because I'm always struck by the number of midfield combinations Hibs had in the middle last season, and the one that really seemed to work, the one that seemed to be the one that clicked for most of that 17-game unbeaten run was Triantis and Levitt. And I think it was really because Triantis was doing things that Levitt didn't need to, and it freed Levitt up to just be able to do the things that he was good at. And we saw that at Dundee United, I think, when he was playing alongside Jandel Fuchs. It was very much the same, that Jandel Fuchs was doing all the dirty work, and Levitt was able just to concentrate on his strengths, concentrate on his game. Yeah. Hibs haven't always had that right combination in midfield that allows the players to do that. So it's not. I've always felt it's not just about can we bring this player in and can they do X, Y, and Z. It's can we bring this player in and can they dovetail with whoever we're playing them alongside? Exactly. Them, and it's the sort of sum of its parts thing, isn't it? It's trying to find a blend that works, that is either going to be one that you can use in every game and tweak, or different combinations for different games. And it's difficult when you've got a lone player and their future's undecided, and it's unclear what the summer's going to look like. Are Hibs going to be in Europe? Are they going to be preparing for the League Cup group stages? So there's an awful lot of moving parts, and I think regardless of whether Barlaser wants to stay, whether Hibs want to explore a permanent deal for him, he needs to have a sort of strong end to the season, both in the final 2 pre-split games, but also after the split as well, because it's ultimately will benefit Hibs and it will benefit him whatever happens.
Yeah, and he does need to demonstrate that the Motherwell's not a fluke, but it's a one-off change in the way he does things. I think that performance against Motherwell, on a very basic level, I mean, completely agree that it's probably too early to sort of say who Hibs should be going for, what Hibs should be looking to rebuild, because there are so many moving parts, there are so many variables. But on a sort of basic level, if there's a player who can show that this has been the big criticism of my game, now I'm going to go to this team who do this thing really well, and I'm going to show that I do have multiple facets. I can deal with that. I think going into games like Hearts, like Rangers and Celtic, if that then transpires sort of being a facet, it seems like a pretty good deal for me. I mean, brings a lot of class into the Hibs midfield. Obviously, sort of that kind of metronomic ability to pass. So long as there's that movement forward, like we saw on Saturday, then I think it's a good solution, good situation, good all of the goods. In the last couple of minutes I thought I'd have a quick chat about Kilmarnock game. I mean, obviously it's a wee bit away with Scotland. All international teams, not just Scotland, but Scotland are playing 2 games. But thinking about the attacking problem, because this is now the second consecutive 0-0 draw. Hibs are having a problem scoring goals. I guess. Who do you think sort of sets up against Kilmarnock? Who do you go for in strike? I know you've mentioned Ellie Yuan, who we've not seen for a wee while now, was, I think, at Fir Park, but wasn't involved in the match day squad. I think was on the bench the week before. Does Ellie play a role? Does Ellie sort of help to unlock Kilmarnock like he did last time?
It's a good question. I think what comes into it is the international games and the fact that both Martin Boyle and Ante Schuto are going to be travelling to and from Australia, and because of the situation in the Middle East, the journey has been made more complicated.
Boyle said something like 30 hours on it.
Something like 30 hours, and it's I think going via London, via Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, going via all sorts of places to get there, and you have to assume it's going to be the same on the way back, and that's it's the first time that Schutos will have done this. So I think that's something that will come into play. I mean, obviously the players are kind of given the once over when they come back, sort of ascertain whether they're ready or not to play, how ready they are, if they're capable of starting, if it's a place on the bench, that sort of thing. So Boyle's obviously done this numerous times. I would say he's probably more likely to kind of sail through it. For Schuto, it might be slightly different because this is the first time he's doing it. So that that maybe comes into the thinking as well. You've obviously got Owen Elding, who came off the bench at Motherwell, maybe a little bit unlucky not to keep his place in the starting lineup.
Played really quite well against Motherwell as well. Showed a lot of, obviously another one of these strikers that wasn't able to sort of impose themselves in the box, but you could see his sort of technical ability in spades at times.
Yeah. And I think, whether he starts, whether he comes off the bench, he's sort of giving you something different. Ellie Yuan, like you mentioned, I mean, I don't think he's actually had game time since the last derby, when he sort of famously passed the ball out of play, much to the chagrin of the Hibs support and the coaching staff. So I think, I mean, that, you know, that could just be sheer coincidence. But I mean, we've spoken about this before, that he is a player who kind of has that mercurial ability to kind of produce something out of nothing. You know, we know what he's capable of doing. As you mentioned, his last performance against Kilmarnock, and then, you know, that was a bit of an unexpected start, but 2 goals and a good performance. But he's out of contract in the summer with 7 games left. Are we going to see him again on the pitch? Is he going to get minutes? It's impossible to say. There's also Dane Scarlett, who came off the bench against Motherwell, and you know, I think it's for David Gray. He's got several options, but it's, I think, trying to find a combination that's going to work. He's tried a couple against Livingston and Motherwell. It's not had the desired effect. I think against Livingston, Hibs created a lot, but didn't take their chances, and then against Motherwell, they didn't create a lot. Part of that was down to, I think, you know, it is a bit sort of one-dimensional. We're just funneling the ball out to Nicky Cadden and getting him to put crosses in. So that's something else to think about, that if they can mix up the routes to goal, for instance, if they're getting the right side more involved, if you're getting, you know, Chaiwa and Paslak involved, even Ahora down that right flank, then it's something different for teams to deal with, rather than just saying we're playing Hibs, so they'll attack us down our right side. But I think, you know, something's got to change, because that is 2 games without goals, and this is a Hibs team that hasn't really struggled to score goals. And I think that it's not just the strikers, and I think it was Warren O'Hora who said this after the Livingston game, that strikers obviously are looked upon as the main supply of goals, but it's down to the whole team.
Yeah, we're all responsible to contribute.
Exactly, and he was pointing out that, you know, he's missed a good few chances this season, you know, from set pieces, and you know, it's just that sort of thing. When things aren't going your way, like last season for Hibs, maybe they were, when they're having the 17-game unbeaten run. This season, they're maybe not. But I think that whoever starts, there's got to be maybe a little bit of, I don't know what you call it. I don't know whether it's kind of shooting on sight. I don't know whether it's just shooting first, asking questions later, that sort of thing, or if it's equalising before the other team scores, that kind of thing. I think it's just, it's concerning when you have a team that draws a blank in 2 games, particularly against the bottom of the table side, and with the number of chances they created. But you look at the Dundee game and you look at the chances they created there, you look at the chances they took, and you've got Jamie McGrath scoring, you've got Owen Eldon scoring, you've got Ante Shuto scoring. So you've got a mix, you've got the strikers scoring, you've got midfielders chipping in. I would be very surprised if Hibs go for a 3rd consecutive game without finding the net. It just doesn't seem to be the way they operate.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't remember a 0-0 draw. I think there was a 0-0 draw before this sort of period of 2, but I can't remember when it was. It certainly doesn't come to mind there being a game where Hibs.
We scrub them from our mind. They don't exist after a certain point. But it's exactly, and it is very sort of unusual for Hibs.
It's not very Hibs, is it?
It's not, no. Because if they're not scoring, then they're usually conceding in the last minute. But I think, all joking aside, it is sort of a bit unlike Hibs, and I would be very surprised if they draw a blank against Kilmarnock. People put mark on this as we speak. But I think the obviously the onus is on David Gray and the coaching staff to find a blend that works, not only in attack, but just in terms of getting the ball in the box. And, you know, credit to Motherwell for how they played, because they did very well to kind of pin Paslak and Cadden at Fir Park and stop them from supplying crosses into the box, and the centre-backs dealt with the forwards very well. But then, you know, the way Hibs were playing wasn't really conducive to getting the strikers into the box all that much. So it's something for David Gray to think about. Kilmarnock will be a very different test to Motherwell. It's a home game, which, you know, you would hope would sort of work in Hibs' favour. But when you look at how Kilmarnock have been playing recently and kind of, you know, enjoying a bit of an uptick in form, then it's going to be a very different game to the last time out at Rugby Park. So it's going to be a challenge. But I think with the international break, I know you've got Boyle and Shuto away on international duty, but it is a chance for you know, David Gray to spend a bit more time on the training ground with his strikers and his creators as well, as playmakers, to just kind of find something that works and find, you know, new routes of getting the ball into the box that aren't going to be shut down straight away by an opposition who's become sort of accustomed to the way Hibs are going to play. Yeah,
having that time's a very important thing. But exactly like you say, Kilmarnock under Neil McCann look look better than they did, and obviously being involved in that relegation fight. I mean, exactly the same as we saw in the 0-0 draw against Livingston. You know, these teams that have to fight tooth and nail to stay up are always going to pose a problem. So there'll be lots to think about over the course of this international window. Lots for us to think about as well on the content front, and lots for you to read and see over the next week or so. So do stay with us. Enjoy the international break. Fingers crossed for a couple good games for Scotland against Japan and the Ivory Coast at the new Everton Hill Dickinson Stadium, which I did think about going to, but wee bit of a distance if you're on your way, and enjoy the game. And yep, do subscribe to the Hibs Observer on social media. We're on all of the platforms, and look forward to seeing you next week here on the Dunbar End podcast. Thanks, and see you soon.
Find the biggest voices in sport on the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Like the Managers with me, Mick McCarthy.
And me, Tony Pulis.
Join us on our podcast, which is all about football managers, talking to football managers about what it's like to be a football manager. Search the Managers and listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Sports Social Podcast Network.